Dopamine. We hear it all the time on social media. We hear how it affects our brain. But what really is it? How can we change our dopamine? Well, today we're going to find out from 3 different clips from 3 different scientists who explain dopamine and how we can use it to help us, how we can change it. This is Science Hub, where we discuss science and how it affects your body. First up, we have Dr. Daniel Amen. Dr. Amen is the founder and CEO of Amen Clinics, and here he'll discuss dopamine and how it affects us.
There are downsides to dopamine. When you use cocaine or alcohol or marijuana, all of those have the rewarding effect of dopamine to push on the pleasure buttons in your brain. But the more they push on the dopamine centers, the more they sort of wear them out, and then you need more and more to feel anything at all. So if you're smoking, if you're vaping, if you're doing any of those other drugs, do whatever you can to stop that. And one supplement strategy is N-acetylcysteine. It seems to really help people decrease their cravings, low dopamine, and can be incredibly helpful.
Next up, we have Dr. Andrew Huberman. He is a neuroscientist and a professor at Stanford University. He also runs the Huberman Lab podcast. Here, he will talk about different ways that are pretty simple to increase your baseline dopamine.
So how do we achieve a healthy baseline level of dopamine? Well, there we can really look to some foundational practices that perhaps you've heard about on this podcast before, and that to some of you might seem a little mundane, although some of them are a bit more sophisticated, maybe even esoteric. The good news is that we can all control these things, and they don't require purchasing anything, but they do require some degree of regular upkeep and effort. Those are going to be getting sufficient amounts of quality sleep each night. Getting sufficient sleep each night literally restores your dopamine reserves. It allows dopamine to be present and for you to have a level of baseline dopamine that will allow you to even consider your goals in any kind of meaningful or reasonable way. Second, there are practices that are supported by the scientific literature to increase your baseline level of dopamine that are independent of sleep, but are similar to sleep. And I like to refer to these as non-sleep deep rest. This is not meditation. There's actually very little evidence that meditation of the traditional kind of, sitting eyes closed, third eye, focusing on your third eye center, which is this area behind your forehead. There is very little evidence that increases levels of dopamine. Non-sleep deep rest, so-called NSDR, very similar, although different to what's sometimes called yoga nidra, which is where you lie there, you do a sort of body scan, some long exhale breathing. NSDR is very similar. Those have been shown to increase the amount of dopamine in your dopamine reserves by up to 65%, which is a remarkable number. In addition to that, nutrition no doubt plays a role in your baseline level of dopamine because tyrosine, the amino acid, is the rate-limiting enzyme for the synthesis of dopamine. Tyrosine is present in varying levels in different foods. You can look those up online. You just simply put in a search for tyrosine levels in different foods, everything from particular cheeses like Parmesan cheese has high levels of tyrosine, certain meats, certain nuts, certain vegetables. Without getting into details and specifics, you can find those there. But you need proper nutrition and therefore nutrients, in particular tyrosine, in order to have sufficient levels of baseline dopamine. And fourth on the list is going to be movement, exercise of varying kinds. It could be resistance training, it could be cardiovascular training. That does increase levels of dopamine. Here we're not talking about achieving peaks in dopamine. Right? That could be accomplished through setting a personal record, a PR, or through sprints or heavy lifts, or learning some new dynamic movement. What we're really talking about here is getting into a regular exercise program of, if not every day, at least 5 days a week, a mixture of cardiovascular and resistance exercise. That we also know is known to elevate and maintain an elevated level of baseline dopamine.
Finally, we have Daniel Z. Lieberman, who's a professor for clinical affairs at George Washington University and a psychiatrist. Here, he talks about dopamine and why we should change how we feel about it.
But look what happens next. Look what happens if day after day we continue to drop pellets in the rat's cage at the same times every day. We train the rat to expect the reward, and the dopamine signal disappears. Now, the rat is devouring the pellet of food with just as much apparent pleasure as ever, but the dopamine response is gone. Why? The answer is that dopamine is not the molecule of pleasure. Dopamine is the molecule of novelty. Only unexpected rewards trigger dopamine. The scientific term for this is reward prediction error. As we go through life, we're constantly making predictions about what the future holds, particularly with regard to rewards. You open up your wallet expecting to see $40 and there's $60 in there. You just made an error with your reward prediction and you get a little spray of dopamine. Let me give you another example. You're walking down the street on the way to work. You've walked down the street dozens of times before. Nothing has changed, and your dopamine system is at rest. All of a sudden, you realize a brand new bakery has just opened up. Bang! Dopamine. Your future just got a little bit more interesting. So you walk in, order a croissant, cup of coffee, delicious. You decide that from now on, you're going to come here every day for breakfast. And then what happens? 2 weeks later, you're sitting in the bakery, chewing on your croissant. Nothing.
Thank you for watching. That's all. I hope these clips helped you. If they did, make sure to leave a like and hit the subscribe button.